You take one of the most detailed, layered fantasy book series ever written, hand it to two television producers, and ask them to compress thousands of pages into a TV show. The result either destroys the source material completely, or it becomes something genuinely great on its own terms. Game of Thrones, for its first several seasons, managed to be the second thing, and then it managed to be the first thing, but we are not here to talk about Season 8 today. What we are here to talk about is Season 1. Because the gap between the show and the book right from the start is far more interesting and far more deliberate than most people realize. Some changes were made for budget, some were made for clarity, and some were genuinely brilliant improvements on George R.R. Martin's already brilliant work. Let's go through all of it. One of the most quietly significant things the show decided to cut is warging. For anyone unfamiliar, warging is the ability to slip your consciousness into an animal and see through its eyes, hear through its ears, and essentially become it for a while. All of the Stark children have this ability in the books, tied directly to their direwolves. The show barely touches this. Bran gets the most screen time with it, and even then the show eventually forgets he can do it. But in the books, it is everywhere. Jon Snow wargs into Ghost regularly. He has what the book calls wolf dreams. He runs through the dark, he hunts, and the theory that has circulated among book readers for years is that when Jon is assassinated at the end of a dance with dragons, he does not simply die. He retreats into Ghost. That is how he survives long enough to be brought back. And the version of Jon that comes back may not be entirely the same man who left, because slipping in and out of an animal mind changes you. Arya, even after she and Nymeria are separated in the very first book, continues to share dreams with her wolf. Through those dreams, readers slowly piece together that Nymeria has built a pack. A large one, roaming the Riverlands, causing problems. This mirrors what Arya herself is becoming, someone detached from her name and her identity, still dangerous, still wild. The show cutting this was probably a practical decision. Showing psychic-animal connections every episode is expensive and complicated, but what gets lost is a layer of the Stark identity that the show could never quite replace. These children are tied to something ancient and primal, and that connection matters to the larger story George is building. Sometimes a television adaptation does something so right that it almost embarrasses the source material. Tywin Lannister is one of those cases. In the books, Tywin is a presence. You feel his shadow over everything. He is feared, he is respected, and when he finally does appear, he commands every room. But he is not deeply explored. We understand what he wants and roughly how he operates, but the interiority is limited. Charles Dance changed that. The very first scene the show gives Tywin was invented entirely for the screen. He is skinning a stag while talking to Jaime, and almost everything about that scene is doing multiple things at once. He is literally getting his hands bloody. He is criticizing Jaime for the attack on Ned Stark, not because it was wrong, but because caring what people think of you is a weakness. He barely looks at Jaime unless he needs something from him. That scene establishes Tywin as someone who treats even his own children as political assets. It draws a line between him and Ned Stark, who is also shown being a father in that episode. Ned gives Arya her sword and tells her to be careful with it. Tywin gives Jaime a lecture and looks at him the way you look at a disappointing investment. The book gives us enough Tywin to be impressed. The show gives us enough to understand him. That is the difference, and it is not a small one. This is where the adaptation makes a change that is harder to evaluate, because both versions have serious problems, just different ones. In the show, Daenerys' wedding night with Khal Drogo is portrayed as assault. She is frightened, he does not ask, and the scene is shot to make that clear. It is dark and uncomfortable, which is probably the honest reaction to a 13-year-old being sold into marriage. Except in the book, Daenerys is also 13 and the scene is written differently. Drogo is patient. He waits for her signal. The book frames it as something approaching tenderness, which is its own kind of problem given her age. George R.R. Martin has been criticized heavily for this, and the criticism is fair. What the show does by making it overtly non-consensual is remove the ambiguity, which some readers felt made the book version almost more troubling, because it seemed to ask readers to find the scenes sweet. Neither version is without issues, but the show's choice does affect how we understand Daenerys' arc, because her agency in the book comes in part from reclaiming what happened to her on her terms. The show has to build that arc from a different starting point. Both versions get to the same place eventually. She loves him, he loves her, and then he is gone. But how they get there is meaningfully different, and it says something about what each medium was comfortable putting in front of an audience. Let's spend some time on scenes that simply do not exist in the book, because a surprising number of the most memorable moments from Season 1 are pure invention. Ned Stark and Jaime Lannister do not have a single conversation in a Game of Thrones. Not one. They clash in the street at the end, and that is the extent of their direct interaction. But the show gives them 2 scenes together before that, and those scenes do something the book cannot easily do. They establish the philosophical conflict between these 2 men before it becomes a physical one. Jaime is sarcastic, charming, and not entirely wrong about anything he says. Ned is rigid and principled and also not wrong. And the camera work in those scenes is doing a lot of quiet storytelling. The Iron Throne sits behind Jaime when he defends killing the Mad King. The lighting splits his face between shadow and light. This was not the books, this was the show working at the level of the books. Then there is the Robert and Cersei scene in Episode 5. These 2 people genuinely cannot stand each other, have not been able to stand each other for most of their marriage, and the show sits them down and lets them be honest about it. There are no equivalent scenes between them in the book because Robert has no point of view chapters and Cersei does not get hers until later books. What that scene does is make Robert human. He was a great man who became a bad king and he knows it, and for about 3 minutes in Episode 5 he is allowed to be sad about that. It is one of the best scenes in the entire series and it was invented from scratch. The scene where Ned tells Jon they will talk about his mother next time they see each other, also invented. Also devastating. Sean Bean plays the tremor of a man who has carried a secret for 15 years and is almost ready to let it go. And then he never gets the chance. These are not adaptations of the book. These are the show being its own thing, using the world George built to go somewhere he had not taken us on the page. Here is a quick one, but it matters more than people give it credit for. The Iron Throne in the show is a large, uncomfortable chair. Visually striking, immediately recognizable, you would put it on a t-shirt. George R.R. Martin has said publicly that it does not look anything like what he imagined. In the books, the Iron Throne is enormous, asymmetric, pieces of it jut out at dangerous angles. It has actually cut previous kings who sat on it. It is genuinely hostile as an object, which is the point, because it represents conquest and power that has not been softened into something comfortable. Sitting on it is supposed to be an act of physical endurance. The show made a practical call. The prop had to fit on a set, travel to conventions, appear in marketing. You cannot build a throne the size of a small building and photograph it for a poster. So they made something that photographed well, and they lost the idea that the seat of power in Westeros is an object that literally harms the people who claim it. House of the Dragon, it should be noted, took another step toward the book version, still not quite there, but closer. Maybe the next spin-off will finally get it right. The show introduces Jon Snow brooding alone in the Winterfell courtyard while the feast carries on inside. He is excluded because Catelyn did not want a bastard at the royal table. It sets him up as an outsider, which is correct, but it gives him a particular kind of melancholy. In the book, Jon is at the feast. He is drinking as much wine as he wants, which is its own kind of freedom. He talks to Benjen about joining the Night's Watch. Then he stands up a bit too fast, stumbles drunkenly into a serving girl, sends wine crashing across the floor, and is laughed out of the hall. He meets Tyrion outside in the yard right after this. That version of Jon is less brooding and more just a teenager who has had too much to drink and made a fool of himself. The show chose to give him dignity and isolation. The book chose to give him embarrassment and underneath that something more grounded and human. Both choices work for the character they are building. But the book's Jon in that scene is funnier and, weirdly, easier to root for, because making an idiot of yourself at a party is something most people understand. The scene where Jaime walks over to mock Jon for joining the Night's Watch, that is entirely the show's invention. But it lands because the dynamic it sets up, Jaime and Jon as 2 men who have both taken oaths that cost them something, is genuinely interesting and pays off later when you understand what Jaime gave up for the Kingsguard. Let's get into something that has confused viewers and book readers for literal decades, because the show made choices here that became genuinely contradictory by later seasons. When Daenerys walks into Drogo's funeral pyre and emerges with 3 dragons and no clothes, the show frames it as evidence that Targaryens are immune to fire. She looks untouched. She looks like fire is just something that happens around her without consequence. The book version loses more. Her hair is entirely gone. She is burned, not fatally, but the cost is visible. George R.R. Martin said in 1999, and this is not a paraphrase, that Targaryens are not immune to fire. He was direct about it. The survival on the funeral pyre was a unique magical event tied to the hatching of the dragons. It was not a permanent condition. It was a miracle with specific circumstances.